Hey guys, tonight we're going to tiptoe into a world where being clever was not a compliment, especially if you were born with the wrong anatomy. You open your eyes beneath a damp wooden roof. The thatch above you leaks slightly, just enough to tap out a quiet rhythm that'll drive you slowly mad by morning. You stretch out your limbs on the straw mattress, careful not to bump the pot of dried herbs you stashed beneath your bedding just in case someone peeks in. See? You're smart. And in this world, that's dangerous. The wind hisses through the slats in the shutters. Somewhere outside, a rooster is yelling at the moon like it owes him money. You yawn and think about how today, like every day, you'll have to pretend you're just a normal, obedient woman who never asks too many questions, never corrects the priest, never reads too fast or too well, never gets caught staring at the stars and wondering how they move. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and what time you're curling up with this history. Are you sneaking it in before bed or drifting off mid-chicken story? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's the 1300s. You're living in a small English village. Life here is narrow fields, food and faith. Everyone knows their place, and if you ever forget yours, don't worry, someone will remind you, usually loudly and with a stick. But you're a little different. You notice things. You remember everything you hear. You even learned to read when no one was looking, watched your brother practice letters, listened as the old priest mumbled through Latin prayers. Now you can decipher strange symbols on parchment, piece together stories from scraps. But here's the catch. You can't let anyone know, because when women know things, people get nervous. You walk through the village square, head covered, eyes down. A baker's boy calls you Owl Eyes. You try to smile politely, but inside, you bristle. Because you caught him mismeasuring his grain the other day, and he knows it. In this world, intelligence isn't a compliment. For men, it's strength. For women, it's a threat. People start whispering when you talk too confidently. You notice old Thomas muttering prayers behind you after you pass. That's never a good sign. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly feared female intellect or just used it as an excuse to enforce social norms. But the truth remains, if you displayed too much curiosity, too much independence, too much you became suspect. The line between clever and cursed? Thin as embroidery thread. And that fear didn't always come from strangers. Your own mother, hunched over the hearth, once snapped, "Stop thinking so loud. It'll bring nothing but trouble." You wanted to ask her why. You always want to ask why. Later that week, you help an older woman give birth in the next village over. You use warm rags, whisper soothing words, and mix a tea that helps with the pain. She calls you blessed. But back home, someone saw you picking herbs. Someone says you talk to animals. Someone says you look too long at the moon. The accusations don't come all at once. They drip in, like that leak in your ceiling's low, steady, ruinous. First it's curiosity, then arrogance, then witchcraft. And just like that, you're standing barefoot in a wooden pen while the constable decides if you should be dunked in the river, just to be safe. Here's the joke: if you drown, you're innocent. If you float, you're a witch. Heads, you die. Tails, you still die. There's no prize for cleverness here. No blue ribbons or proud plaques. Just mud, judgment, and a public spectacle with extra pitchforks. That's why life sucked for smart women in medieval times. Because knowledge didn't mean power, it meant danger. It meant isolation. It meant pretending to be less than you are, shrinking every idea until it could safely fit inside a thimble or a prayer book. But the strangest thing? Some women still dared to be brilliant anyway. Quietly, carefully, in secret. Their courage didn't come with trumpets, it came with whispers, the language of survival. And you're starting to realize that this world was not made for you, but you're not ready to disappear into the dust just yet. You wake early, but not because the day promises excitement. It's because your brother is stomping around, trying to remember where he left his boots, and your mother is already outside, gathering eggs and muttering about frost. No one expects you to learn anything today, except how to keep your mouth shut and your hands busy. That's the kind of education girls get in this world. And if you were hoping for books, lessons, or even just time to think, forget it. There's no schoolhouse waiting for you with a chalkboard and rows of eager girls. Education is a locked door, and the key is shaped suspiciously like a Y chromosome. Your brother, for all his clumsiness and hay-stuffed brain, gets to study with the priest. He practices letters, chants, psalms, even gets to read chronicles of far-off saints and noble kings. You're told to fetch water and mind the fire. If you ask about books, they laugh. What would a girl do with Latin? Your uncle said once, chortling into his ale. Charm the chickens? But here's the twist. Education wasn't technically banned for women. It just wasn't offered. You could learn to read if your family was rich and progressive enough to hire a tutor for everyone, or if you joined a convent. But for the average girl in a thatched roof home, curiosity was treated like a splinter irritating, best removed quickly, and definitely not worth attention. Historians still debate whether some rural girls might have picked up basic literacy by accidental ping scribes, copying labels, overhearing lessons, but none of that changed the fact that formal education was a male domain. Your brother might be lazy, but he holds the quill. You hold the spoon. One afternoon, while sweeping ash from the hearth, you hum the Latin prayer your brother mumbled last night. The syllables feel strange and sharp in your mouth. Your grandmother hears and stares at you, broom clutched tight like it might ward off whatever devilry you just summoned. Don't mimic the priest, she hisses. You'll bring shame. And just like that, a fragment of knowledge turns to threat. You spend the next few days pretending you're not interested. You ask no questions. But inside, your mind burns. You want to know what those words meant. You want to know where the stars go at dawn. You want to know why God is always male in the stories. But the world around you offers no answers, only chores. You learn to bake bread with your mother, kneading dough with fingers that itch to hold ink instead. You stitch crude initials into linen with trembling thread. You grind herbs for your aunt, memorizing their properties though no one ever calls you a healer, just helpful. Not that it matters. If someone sees you studying the wrong leaf too long, you'll earn a raised eyebrow or worse. There's a girl in the next village, about your age, who was caught sneaking into the rectory to look at the priest's scrolls. Her father whipped her. The priest had her clean latrines for a month to remind her of her place. That girl doesn't talk much now, but when your paths cross at market, she gives you a glance, sharp and quick. You both know the look, hunger for something more. Sometimes you daydream about a different life, one where you're born into a merchant's family, sent to Italy, taught to read the way boys are. You imagine candlelit rooms full of scrolls, ink-stained hands, voices arguing over Aristotle and logic. Instead, you're here, elbow deep in dough, while your brother mangles his way through a psalter and gets praised for trying. The irony? You're probably smarter than him. You remember things better. You listen more. You ask questions. But those traits are threats in a woman. They make you difficult, unmarriageable. So, you smile. You nod. You say nothing when your brother recites a verse wrong, and your father calls him clever. You swallow the correction like a bitter berry. One night, when everyone's asleep, you sneak to the fire. You've hidden a scrap of parchment under a loose floorboard. It's nothing special, just a piece torn from an old religious tract, its edges scorched and crinkled. But you trace the letters with your finger like they're gold. You sound them out, slow and careful. The words don't come easy, but you get there. And when you whisper them aloud, it feels like flying. This is your secret education. No desks, no quills, no lessons. Just stolen moments, dangerous words, and a hunger you can never admit out loud. Because if anyone finds your parchment, they'll say you stole it. They'll say you're possessed. They'll say you're not right in the head. And that's the generous version. One of the village elders once said, "A learned woman is like a plough horse that sings unnatural and probably cursed." You didn't laugh, though everyone else did. You just stared at the fire, thinking about how plough horses work themselves to death whether they sing or not. Here's the part no one says out loud. Ignorance isn't just enforced, it's expected. Girls aren't meant to know. You're taught to keep house, not keep records. To memorize prayers, not compose them. To bear children, not ideas. A curious girl is like a candle left too near the thatch lovely for a moment, then dangerous, then gone. So, when you walk to church, head low, steps careful, you remind yourself not to glance too long at the scriptures, not to nod when the priest misquotes, not to answer questions even when you know the answer, because it's safer to be silent. safer to smile, safer to pretend that you don't know things you shouldn't. Still, when you pass the stone statue of the Virgin Mary, eyes cast down, you whisper your questions to her. Maybe she understands. Maybe once, long ago, she asked why too. Or maybe she's just another face carved by men to tell women what they can't be. But you keep asking, quietly, always, because even in a world that tries to stamp it out, knowledge finds cracks. It grows like moss between stones, silent and green and stubborn. You stare at the sky as dawn thins the dark, brushing gold across the clouds like a sleepy painter who hasn't yet had their coffee or gruel, in your case. You've got dirt under your nails, the hem of your shift smells like cabbage, and your thoughts are far too loud for someone expected to keep them folded like laundry. There's a decision ahead of you, one that girls like you don't get to make lightly. Stay here and rot under the weight of your own brain, or risk it all for the only place a woman might be allowed to think: the convent. Now, don't get too excited. A convent in the Middle Ages isn't Hogwarts for girls. It's more like a cross between a boot camp, a prison, and a poorly insulated library with an emphasis on prayer and silence. But if you're lucky, and I mean win the medieval lottery kind of lucky, you might get accepted into one that has books, actual books, not stories handed down over soup pots or sung in taverns, books copied by hand, in ink that took hours to mix, on parchment made from stretched animal skin, a whole sacred hoard of ideas you could never touch in the outside world. Your aunt, on your mother's side, joined a convent years ago. The story goes that she was too clever to marry and too stubborn to die quietly. So, she devoted herself to God, which everyone said with the same tone you'd use for she ran off with a juggler. She sent your family a single letter once, with stiff lettering and pressed lavender. You remember the scent more than the words. But tucked inside was something you never forgot. A riddle in Latin, written in a tiny, careful hand. It took you weeks to work out, using your brother's discarded prayers and a whole lot of guesswork. When you solved it, you cried. Not because it was hard, but because someone like you had written it. Historians still argue whether convents were truly spaces of female empowerment, or just another flavor of medieval cage. But for smart women, they offered a paradoxical gift: isolation, with a side of education. You couldn't talk back to men, but you could study saints. You couldn't roam free, but your mind could, just a little. If you didn't mind cold mornings, endless prayers, and the occasional beating for pride, you might even get to scribe a manuscript or two. So you start planning quietly. You begin praying more in public, nodding fervently during sermons, wearing your most pious expression like it's a second face. You make it known that you're touched by the Holy Spirit, which is the acceptable medieval code for weird girl who talks too much. It works. A friar passing through offers to carry a message to the convent in the next town. You write carefully, no ink blotches, no spelling errors. You ask for admission. You tell them you feel called. You leave out that it's not God calling, but your own mind screaming for air. Weeks pass. Then, a reply. They'll take you. Not for your brain, of course officially, it's your devotion that earned you a place. But that's fine. You're used to pretending. Your mother cries when you tell her. Your father shrugs. Your brother laughs. You'll be bored in a week, he says, spooning stew like it's a profound act of philosophy. You just nod. You don't tell them about the butterflies in your chest, about the way your pulse stutters when you imagine rows of books, and silence thick enough to think in. And yet, when you arrive, the dream quickly cracks. The convent is cold, literally. You sleep on straw, wake before the sun, and scrub floors until your hands bleed. You're expected to fast twice a week and remain silent unless addressed. The food tastes like regret, and the chapel smells like damp stones and stale incense. And still you're happier than you've ever been. Because in the corner of the scriptorium, behind a curtain that smells like mildew, is a shelf of books, real ones, written by dead men in Latin and Greek, copied by aching hands, full of sentences that wind and twist like ivy on a wall. You aren't allowed to touch them yet, but you watch. You watch the older nuns transcribe them, muttering as they copy, pausing to sharpen their quills. You watch, and you wait. After a month, you're given a task. Clean the scriptorium. You take twice as long as necessary, dusting carefully, reading upside down as you go. One day, a nun leaves a page open. A hymn to the Virgin, written in delicate red and black ink. You memorize 3 lines before the candle goes out. That night, you whisper them to yourself in bed, tasting the Latin like honey. One of the nuns notices. Sister Agnes, they call her. She has eyes like cracked glass and fingers stained with ink. She pulls you aside after Vespers. "You read, don't you?" she asks. You freeze. Deny. 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 But something in her voice, calm, knowing, makes you nod. Just once. She studies you. Then says, "Be here before dawn tomorrow. Don't be late." You come. Of course you come. She gives you a prayer book and watches as you sound out the first sentence. Your Latin is shaky, but your hunger is clear. "We'll begin with grammar," she says. And just like that, your world cracks open. Every morning, before the others wake, you learn. Verbs, declensions, scripture. You write your name. You write lines of scripture. Eventually, you write questions. Sister Agnes always answers them, even when she disagrees. "God gave us minds to use," she says once, after a heated argument about a psalm's meaning. "Just not everyone agrees with that. And it's not perfect. You still scrub, still fast, still live in silence most of the day. But those hours with Agnes are light in the gloom. She teaches you not just words, but ideas. Stories of women who once learned, too, like Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote music and studied plants, like Trotta of Salerno, a physician whose name was almost lost, like the unnamed nun who carved a message into the back of a manuscript. I was here, I learned. You wonder if you'll leave a mark someday. Probably not. Your name won't survive, your work might vanish. But for now, you exist, you learn, you think, and that's something. It starts with a book, not a full one, just a fragment, tucked behind a loose stone near the chapel's back wall. You find it during morning cleaning, when you reach too far with your broom and knock a cobwebbed wooden beam loose. Inside, folded and brittle, is a single leaf of parchment. The ink has faded to a dull brown, but the lines remain clear. It isn't scripture, it isn't a hymn, it's a commentary on Galen's theory of humours, annotated in the margins by someone with sharp thoughts and no patience for convention. And the writing? It's a woman's hand. You know because Sister Agnes taught you to tell the difference. Male scribes tend to press hard, angular, impatient. This one flows, cursive and careful. Whoever wrote this knew what she was doing. You slip it into your habit and hide it beneath your mattress. Every night, you read the same lines again, eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. It talks about bile and blood, about the body's balance, and how emotions might be physical things. And then the note stents, challenging, biting. Galen assumes too much. One line mutters, "Where is the proof?" Another says simply, "What if heat is not evil but misunderstood?" You fall asleep, wondering what kind of mind could write that in a time like this. Sister Agnes smiles when you show her. "You found one," she says, as if it's a scavenger hunt. "There are more, and there are. Hidden in bindings, tucked inside scroll cases, scraped clean and overwritten but still faintly visible. You start looking everywhere. A library, within a library, made by women for women, hidden from the men who ruled the ink and the index. Historians still argue whether women secretly circulated their own books in the medieval period, but the traces are therapalimpsests with ghost letters, annotations in feminine script, even the occasional prayer that veers suspiciously into scientific theory. You're holding proof that someone like you dared to think. It becomes your quiet obsession. You scrub floors slower so you can check beneath tiles. You offer to repair bindings, just to peek at the spines. Every time you find a scrapper drawing of a plant with notes in French, a recipe for cough syrup involving honey and crushed moth wings, you feel a flicker of joy. A secret past between centuries. A handshake across time. But not everyone appreciates your enthusiasm. One morning, as you whisper a translation to yourself in the courtyard, another novice named Beatrice turns her head. "Why do you talk like a priest?" she says, not unkindly. It sounds strange in your mouth. You shrug and say nothing, but the words stick. Later that week, Mother Elfrida calls you into her chamber. She's not cruel, but she is cautious. "I hear you've taken an interest in our older texts," she says, stirring her tea. You nod. She sets her cup down with a soft clink. Learning is good, but too much learning can be distracting, especially for women. You want to ask why that is. You want to ask who gets to decide what too much means. But instead, you nod again, lower your gaze, and bite the inside of your cheek until it bleeds. From then on, your lessons with Sister Agnes become even quieter. You begin using coded phrases in your notebook stars instead of letters, dots to replace controversial words. You learn how to write sideways in the margins so it looks like accidental ink smears. You become a student of silence as much as scripture. One rainy evening, Agnes pulls out a text you've never seen before. It's wrapped in linen, sealed with a ribbon so faded, it looks grey. "This was written by a woman," she says, untying it slowly. "A nun from Burgundy, 3 generations before us. She was never published. Her name doesn't appear in any list, but she mapped the stars by hand. Inside are pages of charts, planetary cycles, lunar diagrams, eclipses tracked with terrifying precision. She wasn't supposed to know this," Agnes says, "but she did, and she risked everything to write it down." You run your fingers over the drawings. "Why didn't she sign her name?" Agnes sighs. "Because if she had, she'd have been burned." The thought hangs heavy in the air. All this knowledge, all this brilliance, left to rot in a drawer because someone feared the shape of a woman's thoughts. You look at the stars on the page and imagine the nun who drew them, hunched over a desk by candlelight, whispering to herself the same questions you ask now. Even now, outside these walls, women are punished for knowing too much. A midwife in the next town was accused of disturbing God's will because she saved a mother in childbirth. They say she used powders and charms. They say she knew herbs no decent woman should know. They say she made the baby cry too soon. They say she must have done something unnatural. You hear the whispers in chapel. Witch, temptress, too proud. That last one lands hardest, because it's always used to describe women who refuse to pretend they're dumb. It's hard to ignore the chill that creeps in after stories like that. You begin keeping your notes hidden in the seams of your robes. You learn to answer questions with questions, to offer, "I'm not sure," even when you are. You pretend you're studying less. You pretend to be dumber than you are. It hurts like grinding your teeth in your sleep, but it keeps you safe. One night, Agnes doesn't come to lessons. She's sick, the others say. A fever. You bring her herbs, damp cloths, sit beside her as she sweats and shivers. "Don't stop," she whispers once, in a moment of lucidity. "Even if they never say your name, even if they burn your work, write it anyway." She dies 3 days later. You cry. Not loudly, not openly, but your grief soaks into the parchment. You copy one of her prayers in her script, shaky at first, then steadier. It's not meant for God. It's for her. You tuck it into the lining of her robe before burial. A goodbye letter in ink. A promise. And now, you're alone. But not really, because you know what to do. You start copying the text she hid. You organize the fragments. You teach a younger novice how to spot female script. You show her how to write questions in invisible ink. The work continues, quietly, stubbornly, like roots growing beneath stone. Because yes books were burned, names were erased. But thoughts? Thoughts are slippery things. They hide in corners. They wait. They return. And so do you. You're up before the bells again, but this time not to clean or pray. You creep through the cold cloister on silent feet, the hem of your habit soaked with dew. In your arms, you carry a cloth-wrapped bundle, pages, fragments, notes, copied lines from forbidden margins, Agnes's star maps, the anonymous woman's treatise on herbs, your own questions and the faint answers you've begun to imagine. You're not just preserving these anymore. You're building something. Inside the old storehouse, mostly unused since the last bad harvest, you've cleared a space. Cobwebs make the ceiling feel low, but you don't mind. There's a broken bench that you've turned into a desk, and a dry crate stacked with more folded parchment. Each morning, for just one stolen hour before the sun spills through the cracks, you write. Sometimes you copy, sometimes you speculate, sometimes you write letters you'll never send, to women who lived centuries ago, women you know only by their silence. This is your real prayer now. Ink, words, knowledge. It isn't rebellion, not exactly. You're not shouting at the gates or denouncing God, but you are refusing to disappear. That's enough to get you branded a heretic if you're caught. You wonder how many others did the same. Historians still debate how widespread female scholarship really was in the Middle Ages, but every now and then, a thread unravels. A letter from a nun who knew more astronomy than the local priest. A household ledger scribbled full of formulas. A woman who advised a queen but left no trace in the royal archive. It's like glimpsing bones under the surface of a frozen lake. Fragile, shifting, real. You've learned the rules now. Don't be too clever in public. Never correct a priest. Laugh when the abbot makes a bad joke about Eve and apples. You do all of this with a smile so convincing it feels like armor. But in the back of your mind, you're always writing. Always rewriting. One afternoon, during scripture study, the prioress asks the novices what they think the passage about wise virgins means. The room goes silent. Beatrice, the same girl who once asked why you spoke like a priest, clears her throat. Maybe, she says carefully, it means women who didn't wait for permission to prepare. The prioress doesn't scold her, but she doesn't nod either. Later, Beatrice passes you a scrap of parchment during laundry. On it is a single sentence. What if God gave us minds for more than obedience? You smile. She's ready. You begin teaching her the symbols you use to hide meanings. She learns fast. Her questions become sharper. Her doubts, more beautifully shaped. Now there are two of you. And when you write at night, it's not just to remember, it's to teach. You start recording the things the other nuns say, especially the older ones. Offhand comments about healing, about weather, about when to plant barley, or how to calm a fever in a newborn. You realize quickly that intelligence was never truly rare in women. It was just smothered under generations of silence. One nun, Sister Clara, confides in you after compline. When I was young, she whispers, I helped my mother brew a poultice that saved a knight's life. His surgeon said he was dead already, but he lived. We weren't supposed to know that. I never told anyone until now. You write it down. You add it to your collection. It feels like building a library from whispers. Still, the danger never fully fades. One night, you forget to relock the storehouse. The door creaks open in the wind, and your hidden desk is found. Nothing's taken, but everything's seen. The next morning, Mother Elfrida calls you to her chambers again. She holds one of your pages. Not a controversial one, thankfully just a description of lunar phases, written in careful Latin. But her brow is furrowed. This is your hand? She asks. You nod. Why do you hide what you write? Because you'd punish me if I didn't, you want to say. Instead, you answer, I wasn't sure it was good enough. She studies you a long moment. Her eyes aren't cruel, but they're tired. Write if you must, she says at last. But don't let it make you proud. That's the trick, isn't it? Pride. Not skill. Not brilliance. Not accuracy or value or courage. Just pride, that sin they always throw at women who refuse to look small. You thank her, bow your head, and say nothing. But later, when you copy that page again, you sign it with a symbol you've started using, a tiny, almost invisible spiral at the bottom corner, a mark no one else will understand. But one day, maybe someone will. More and more, the convent begins to feel like a contradiction, a place where you're silenced and yet taught, confined and yet quietly liberated. There's a kind of strength in the structure, like ivy growing up the walls of a cage. You make peace with that. You work within it. You learn how far to push. On feast days, when visitors come, you stay quiet and helpful. No one suspects the girl who stirs the soup to be translating Roman medical texts at night. No one suspects the novice smiling during Mass has been mapping star paths on the back of old sermon pages. You learn to be invisible by choice. It becomes your greatest skill. You even start writing your own work, nothing radical, just observations, the cycles of the moon and how they affect the mood in the dormitory, a list of plants that thrive near graves, a theory about memory, inspired by a novice who remembers the Psalms only when she sings them. It's nothing grand, nothing that would shake the world, but it's yours. You keep everything hidden, of course, tucked under floorboards, inside hollowed hymnals, behind loose stones. But the collection grows, and you start imagining someone finding it one day. Not a man, another girl like you, hungry, cautious, questioning. She'll find your notes and realize she's not alone. You wonder if you'll ever meet her. The seasons shift again, and with them, the convent changes. Winter wraps its fingers around the stones, curling into the walls and seeping into your bones. Your fingers are cracked from cold and ink. Your eyes burn each morning from candle smoke and stolen midnight study. But you don't stop. You can't stop. There are too many questions you haven't answered. Too many women whose thoughts never made it past their own skulls. You feel like you owe them something, a record at least. By now, your stash of writings has outgrown the storehouse. You've started hiding volumes in unexpected places, inside broken pottery, behind the altar's drapery, even sewn into the lining of your winter cloak. You write in code, rotate through different scripts, disguise your sentences within copied prayers. When you kneel in the chapel, no one suspects the psalter in your lap contains a draft essay on cognitive memory theory hidden between the psalms. Then one morning, a new priest arrives. Father Berengar. He's younger than most, but something in his eyes feels old, watchful, calculating. He wastes no time asserting himself. The first thing he does is announce he will be reviewing all instructional texts used by the sisters. The devil creeps into the margins, he warns during sermon, especially when women read too eagerly. You flinch, not visibly, but you know he's seen you. He's already picked you out as dangerous not for what you've said, but for how little you say. Smart women always have a look, and men like him can smell it. That afternoon, you and Beatrice burned 2 pages, not because they were the most damning, but because they were too beautiful to risk in enemy hands. One was a poem Beatrice wrote, disguised as a recipe. The other was your theory on lunar influence and mood cycles written in metaphor, veiled in theology, but still too obvious. You watch the ash curl in the hearth, and wonder how many women before you did the same. Historians still argue whether there was an organized effort to suppress female knowledge during the medieval period, or if it happened through countless small acts of dismissal, ridicule, and fear. Either way, the result is the same. You're living it. Father Berengar begins his inspections. He questions the sisters gently at first, then with increasing edge. Have you ever read texts not in the canon? Have you ever seen apocryphal commentary? Have you heard strange theories whispered in the dormitories? Some sisters weep, others stammer. A few go silent and stay that way. You? You smile. You feign ignorance. You repeat exactly what he wants to hear, like a good, obedient novice. But that night, you move your archive. All of it. You and Beatrice work silently, guided by candlelight, packing your pages into bundles wrapped in oilcloth. You hide them in the root cellar beneath the garden, behind crates no one's touched in years. The smell of turnip rot lingers in your hair for days, but your work is safe for now. You become more careful, more cunning. When Father Berengar offers to test your Latin, you pretend to struggle. When he lectures on the dangers of female pride, you nod with such exaggerated piety, it becomes its own performance. You make yourself smaller, duller, invisible. It works. He grows bored with you and moves on. But you're watching, always watching. One evening, Beatrice doesn't come to supper. You find her in the cloister, her face blotched with tears. He found a page, she whispers. A draft I forgot in my sleeve. You freeze. What did he do? She swallows hard. He tore it up, said I needed more prayer. Then he smiled. That night, you don't sleep, not out of fear but fury, that he could destroy her words like they were nothing, that he could smile while doing it. You realize then how fragile everything is. Not just your pages, your progress, but your very right to think, to imagine, to question. You remember something Sister Agnes once said, a mind is a dangerous thing to bury. Eventually, it grows thorns. So you start making copies. One set stays hidden here. The other, you plan to send. Where? You're not sure. Perhaps the next convent over. Perhaps to the midwife you heard about who was forced into exile but still treats women by moonlight. Perhaps even further tucked into a trade cart, bound for France or Spain, where another curious girl waits. You recruit another novice. Her name is Johanna. She's quiet, observant, pretends to pray longer than she really does. You test her once, leave a coded message in a devotional text she uses. She finds it. She writes back, I see you. There are 3 of you now. You keep writing, of course, but your style changes. You begin framing your knowledge as questions. Does the moon reflect divine rhythm? Could healing be God's voice through nature? You mask your hypotheses in religious language. It's safer that way. Even if Father Berengar reads it, he won't grasp the depth. He only sees surface obedience. And there's something else. The more you write, the more your voice emerges. Not just copied theory, but original thought. You begin noticing things others miss. The way sorrow tightens the jaw, The way memory lingers longer when a candle is lit. The strange calm that falls over the garden during eclipses. You document all of it. Not because you expect glory or publication, those are fantasies for another world, but because it must be done. You have no illusions anymore. You know this story probably won't end with recognition or respect. It may end in silence, or ash. But even that is not nothing. Ash floats, it settles, it whispers. And maybe, just maybe, some of it will stick to a girl's fingers 100 years from now, and she'll wonder who you were. You hope she wonders. The rain has been steady for days now, turning the convent's dirt paths into ribbons of sucking mud, and drowning out whispers with the gentle roar of water cascading from the roof tiles. You press your parchment pages between slates by the hearth to keep them dry, hoping the damp doesn't smudge the ink. Everything feels heavier in the rain robes, steps, silence. But your mind? Your mind is burning brighter than ever. Because something strange has happened. You've started to see yourself not just as a student of knowledge, but as a keeper of it. And that changes things. You're writing less about what was, and more about what could be. Questions that would have gotten you excommunicated or, worse, outside these walls, now form the core of your secret archive. What if divine inspiration comes in the form of inquiry, not obedience? What if knowledge is not just permitted by God, but demanded? You write cautiously, always wrapped in scripture and metaphor, but the message is there. Beneath the gloss of piety, you're building a thesis that challenges the very foundations of how the world sees women and wisdom. And you're not alone anymore. Beatrice has become bold. She copies your work in miniature script onto scraps of cloth that can be hidden in hems and sleeves. She started composing her own observations. To her latest is a series of parallels between the saint's ecstatic visions and symptoms of epilepsy. She doesn't claim they're the same, but her implications are daring. What if holiness, she writes, sometimes begins as a misfiring spark? You read it with your hand over your mouth, afraid of the brilliance that dances there. Johanna, your quietist recruiter, has begun slipping anonymous commentary into the margins of approved texts. Nothing inflammatory, just nudges. A line beneath a poorly translated passage. A question mark next to a dubious miracle. Her handwriting is indistinguishable from the official scribes. It's subtle sabotage, the kind that will live there for years, perhaps forever, challenging future readers to think just a little more critically. 3 minds, 3 voices. A conspiracy of thought in a place that demands silence. Historians still argue whether these convent networks truly existed, or if modern scholars are romanticizing scattered examples. But when you gather in the candlelit storage room and speak, without fear even in whispers, it doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels like resistance. But danger never sleeps long. Father Berengar begins pushing for stricter rules. Too many questions are being asked, he warns the prioress. Curiosity is the garden where sin grows. He preaches longer now. He looks at you more often, and never kindly. He's hunting something. He doesn't yet know what, but he smells it. The prioress, Mother Elfridaha, has grown quieter since Agnes's death. She rarely intervenes, but she watches. You can't tell where she stands anymore. One moment she corrects your Latin with the gentlest of smiles. The next, she reprimands Beatrice for undue focus on theoretical matters. You begin to suspect she knows more than she says, and that silence can mean danger, or protection, sometimes both. To throw suspicion off, you and the others increase your outward obedience. You kneel longer, sing louder, take on extra chores. You recite verses with the measured cadence of perfect humility, and when Berengar preaches against feminine cunning, you keep your eyes down, but inside, you're boiling. Then one day, something changes. A messenger arrives young, muddied, bearing a sealed letter with a wax stamp none of you recognize. It's addressed to the prioress, who reads it in silence before dismissing the messenger with a coin and a wave. Hours later, she calls you to her chambers. You enter with your hands folded, heart pounding. She doesn't speak at first, just looks at you. Then, "There is a scholar in Paris," she says. "He's written about Saint Hildegard, praised her learning. He's looking for more texts authored by women, especially those related to medicine and natural science." You don't breathe. She sets the letter on her desk. "He's asking if we have any such manuscripts." A pause. A silence so sharp it hums. "I told him we do not," she says, "but I haven't sent the reply yet." Your mouth is dry. What will you write? She leans back. eyes on yours. That depends on what I believe we do have. It isn't permission. Not exactly. But it isn't condemnation either. That night, you, Beatrice, and Johanna gather your strongest pieces. Nothing heretical, but bold enough to leave an impression. You bind them carefully with ribbon made from old scapulars. You don't sign your names. You don't date the pages. You only mark them with a symbol, a spiral, drawn in echo of Agnes's final instructions. Write it anyway. Mother Elfrida sends the package a week later. No one speaks of it again, but something shifts in the convent. Berengar still prowls, still preaches, but his edge dulls. Maybe he senses he's lost ground. Or maybe he realizes the roots run too deep to rip out. And you? You keep writing. One day, while scrubbing a stone floor, you hum a melody that Agnes used to sing under her breath. You look up to find Johanna mouthing the words. You both smile quietly, quickly before returning to the rhythm of your brushes. You begin adding marginalia to your own works. Not notes for others, but for yourself. Remember to teach the next girl how to bind without wax. Cross. Reference this with Beatrice's piece on holy fevers. Don't trust anyone who quotes Galen too confidently. You're not just preserving knowledge now. You're designing a method, a roadmap for those who come after you. You wonder if anyone will ever know your name. Probably not. Women's names are often the first thing to vanish. But maybe that doesn't matter. Because now, in 3 hands and 20 hiding places, your work lives. In Paris, it might be read, or it might be burned. Or it might collect dust for a century before some unsuspecting scholar opens it and realizes, a woman wrote this. A smart one, a brave one who did not ask permission. You realize something then, something that settles inside you like warmth after cold. You didn't write to be remembered. You wrote to survive. The wind howls tonight like something wounded. You lie awake, the thin blanket doing little against the cold, and listen to the groan of beams above you and the scrape of tree limbs clawing the chapel walls. Somewhere across the dormitory, Beatrice is snoring softly. Johanna, as always, breathes like a ghost barely audible, barely there. But you're wide awake, staring at the dark ceiling and thinking about what you've done. The manuscript you compiled for Paris has been gone for over 2 weeks. No word, no messenger, just that aching silence of maybe and what if. Every day you wonder if it's been received, if it's been read, if it's been tossed into a fire with a sneer. The not knowing is worse than the fear, because at least fear gives you adrenaline. This just gives you doubt. You begin second-guessing every word you included. The passage comparing lunar cycles to the ebb of human sadness, was it too speculative? Beatrice's allegorical sketch about a chained lioness who learns to read, was that too obvious? You picture a scholar in Paris, holding it at arm's length with tongs, muttering something like, "Oh dear, the sisters have become ambitious." Still, a strange resolve keeps you going. Even if the pages are never seen again, you know you've already done something outrageous. You tried. You reached out into a world that didn't want you to exist and whispered, "I'm here." Historians still debate whether nuns in the Middle Ages saw themselves as intellectuals or merely conduits for scripture. The official records insist their lives were narrow dictated by obedience, enclosed in silence, drowned in repetition. But those records were written by men. You live the truth. You know that within these stone walls, brilliant minds bloom like moss in shadow. You know that even in silence you're screaming. That becomes your new project, documenting the life beneath the silence. You begin recording the things no one else does, the shift in mood when the weather changes, the way prayer feels different when sung by women alone, the rare wild moments of laughter between novices after nightfall. These are not the kinds of things that make it into official histories, but they are the things that build a world. One day, Johanna gives you a scroll. She's been working on a collection of dreams. She's been writing them down each morning, noting patterns, themes, symbols. Some are vivid, flying over stone towers, turning into a raven. Others are mundane but oddly poetic. "I was weaving a tapestry with no thread," she writes, "but the pattern still appeared." You're stunned, not by the dreams but by her insight. "You've created your own theology," you tell her. She blushes and shakes her head, but she doesn't deny it. You add her scroll to the root cellar archive. You're starting to think of it as a living thing, now a hidden heart beneath the convent, pulsing with forbidden thoughts, preserved between layers of wax and cloth. Every time you place a new page into the crate, you imagine someone lifting it decades or centuries from now, and reading your words like relics. The strange thing is, your world outside the archive hasn't changed. You still scrub floors. You still tend to the sick. You still bow your head when Father Berengar passes, though you note with growing satisfaction that his sermons now feel stale, uncertain, a little more frantic. He senses something slipping beyond his reach, and he doesn't know what it is. You know. You smile. The other sisters begin to notice too. Not what you're doing, just that something's different. They start asking questions. What makes the stars move? One murmurs, while folding altar linens. Why does God speak through men, but not women? Asks another, blushing as soon as she does. These aren't recruits yet, but they're seeds, and you've learned that seeds grow silently at first. One night, Beatrice pulls you aside, her face pale. He searched my cell, she says. He lifted my mattress. He smelled my ink. You swallow hard. Did he find anything? She shakes her head. I moved everything yesterday. I don't know why. A breathless pause. It felt like someone whispered to me in my sleep. Move it now. You both sit in the dark and say nothing for a long time. There's nothing to say. Not really. You're playing a game with no rules, no referees, and a finish line no one sees. You can only keep moving and hope you're not caught. But deep down, you realize something else. You're not afraid anymore. You've already lost so much. The right to speak freely, the right to study openly, the right to leave. But you've built something larger than rights. You've built purpose. You spend the next weeks writing more than you ever have. Dozens of pages. On music, on memory, on pain, on forgiveness. You draft an entire treatise on the role of silence as a political tool in religious life, framed, of course, as devotional reflection. It's your finest work. You name it nothing. You don't sign it. But you mark the last page with that small spiral symbol. That's enough. Then, one evening, while walking past the mail shed, you hear it. The sound of a rider dismounting. A courier, dusty, hooded, with a satchel slung over one shoulder. The prioress meets him. You can't hear their words, but you see her face twist in a way you've never seen before, sharp, with suppressed feeling. She holds a letter. She locks eyes with you, just for a moment, before disappearing inside. You don't sleep that night. At dawn, she summons you. You step into her chamber, spine straight, hands trembling. She doesn't speak. She holds out the letter. It's from Paris. You take it. You read. It begins, "To the sister who dares ask." You read the letter in silence, heart pounding so loud it nearly drowns out the words. The script is elegant, confident, slightly flourished at the ends like the pen danced before lifting. The writer never names you, never even assumes you're a woman, but the tone is unmistakably respectful, measured, curious. The enclosed manuscript is both remarkable and daring, it reads. Though anonymous, the author's voice speaks with clarity. I suspect the hand that wrote this belongs to a mind long stifled, yet finely sharpened. If more such pages exist, I urge their preservation and continuation. You swallow hard. There is insight here that deserves dialogue, not silence. You read that line again, and again. Dialoge, not silence. Mother Elfrida clears her throat softly. You look up. She's watching you, the way a midwife watches a newborn's first breath, hopeful, wary, prepared for pain. It's addressed to no one, she says, but clearly meant for you. You don't answer. You can't. Your mind is already running ahead, to the hidden root cellar, to the dozens of pages waiting, the ones you'd considered too rough, too strange, too dangerous to ever share. And now, someone out there, a man, yes, but a man who listened wants more. She sets the letter aside and hands you something else. A parcel, small, wrapped in cloth. Inside is a single book, vellum pages, inked with careful Latin. A commentary, not by a famous scholar, but a woman, a real one, Marguerite of Provence. You've heard her name in whispers, her writings supposedly lost, and now it's here, in your hands, a gift, a torch passed silently across borders and centuries. I didn't send it, the prioress says, voice barely above a breath, but someone did, and now it's here. What happens next is up to you. She doesn't give you permission. She gives you trust. It feels heavier, more sacred. You leave the chamber clutching the parcel and letter, heart thudding, mind buzzing. You want to run to Beatrice and Johanna, to hold up the words and shout, We are seen, but you don't. Not yet. Not until you've read every line, every margin, every annotation in Marguerite's work. You need to know it first. And so, begins a new phase not of rebellion, but of revelation. You don't slow down. You go faster. Your writing sharpens. Your archive expands. The cellar now contains more than theory and observation. It holds letters, dialogues, pages addressed to the scholar in Paris and to others like him. You use the same spiral signature. You begin your letters with the phrase he used. To the reader who dares ask, you don't care anymore if your name is known. The signature is enough. A spiral, a symbol, a presence. That's all you ever needed. Beatrice contributes daily now. She's working on a series of metaphors comparing convent life to Seasonsclever. Sharp, veiled enough to escape censure. Johanna begins recording liturgical songs as mathematical patterns charting mood, tone, and harmony across time. Music, she says, is proof that order and feeling can exist together. She says it once and never again, but you write it down. You begin to dream bigger. Could these pages form a book? Could they be smuggled across other convents? Could they find readers in places even you dare not name? You're not sure, but you plan anyway. You begin collecting tools. Threads, wax, scraps of leather. You learn basic binding techniques from an old repair manual you found buried behind the garden chapel. Stitch by stitch, you form something new. A bound volume of women's voices. The first of its kind, at least in this place, this time. You title it nothing. On the first page, you draw only the spiral. And as the manuscript grows, so does the network. Another sister in the convent begins leaving folded notes in the laundry. At first they're questions. Do you think Mary Magdalene was ever taught to write? What happens to a thought when it is forbidden? You don't know who she is. You don't ask. You reply anyway. The notes continue. One afternoon, Father Berengar falls ill. A fever. Nothing serious, the prioress says, though you notice she doesn't seem in any rush to cure him. He spends a week in bed, unable to preach. The atmosphere in the convent shifts subtly, lighter, braver. In his absence, a visiting monk is sent to lead services. His name is Brother Elias. He's older, quiet, and for the first time in your life you hear a homily that includes questions. Not just answers, not just edicts, but honest uncertainty. He mentions Hildegard, Trota, even Hypatia. He says their names aloud in the chapel, and no one gasps. You glance sideways at Beatrice. Her eyes are wide. Later that evening, you leave a page from your manuscript tucked inside his psalter. Just one page. No signature, no note, just the spiral. He never mentions it. But a week later, when he leaves, he nods to you at the gate. Slow, deliberate. A vow, maybe, or a thank you. And in that moment, you realize something. Your work is leaving the walls. You always feared it would be burned. But what if it's read? What if, in 100 years, someone studies it? What if it changes something? Historians still argue whether anonymous medieval manuscripts attributed to men might have been written by women. Many say yes. Many say, we'll never know. But you're placing your bet. You're writing now not to be remembered, but to seed the future with doubt. And from doubt, questions. And from questions, maybe finally understanding. You still live in a world that demands your silence, but it's no longer winning. Because in every hidden page, every stitched line of ink, every spiral drawn in haste and hope, you've made sure of one thing. The silence now speaks. The air shifts before the change arrives, like the hush before a storm, or the quiet moment when a candle flickers once and goes out. You don't know exactly when it starts, but something in the convent's rhythm slips. A pattern you once trusted stutters. A door creaks in the middle of the night that shouldn't. A broom, always kept in the west alcove, is suddenly missing. You feel it like a splinter beneath your skin. Something is wrong. It's not Father Berengar. He's still recovering, looking thinner, slightly haunted, perhaps from fever dreams. He speaks less now, and when he does, his sermons have lost their bite. No more warnings about clever women or sinful inquiry. Just long readings of psalms with no fire in his voice. You suspect he's been silenced not by you, not directly, but by something quieter. The truth of your existence, perhaps. A rebellion too soft to crush. But that's not the danger. It's the new visitor. A nobleman's chaplain. Sent from the city. A tall man with a gaze that sweeps rooms like a hawk looking for movement. He arrives under the pretense of reviewing the convent's records, its expenditures, its moral atmosphere. He's polite, but in that brittle way that makes you want to hide your hands. He asks questions in a tone that makes even answers feel like crimes. The prioress introduces him over supper. "Brother Sylvan," she says, "a guest from the bishop's court, here to ensure our house remains in good order." He nods. His eyes pass over the assembled sisters. When they reach you, they pause. Just a second too long. You bow your head. You've seen men like him before. Not here, not inside these walls, but in your mind's stories. The kind who don't believe in witches, but still enjoy burning them. The kind who find no peace unless everyone around them is afraid. You don't flinch, but you start preparing. You gather your pages, bind the newest editions, and make 3 new copies. One stays in the cellar. One, you wrap tightly in linen and press into a hollow between bricks in the herb garden wall. The third, you sew page by page into the lining of a blanket meant for the sick ward. "In case," you whisper. You don't say more. You don't need to. Historians still argue whether the sudden purges of certain convent libraries in the later Middle Ages were random acts of zealotry or deliberate erasures. You suspect the latter. You felt it in the tremble of old manuscript pages torn out at odd intervals, entire works missing, referenced but never found. Someone wanted those thoughts to vanish. You won't let it happen again. Beatrice is nervous. Her hands shake during Vespers. Johanna pretends to be ill for 2 days to avoid attention. You try to keep everyone steady. You continue your chores. You smile. You leave small coded notes in the margins of communal books, just enough to be found by someone who's looking, but not enough to draw suspicion. And still, Brother Sylvan watches. He asks to see the archives. The prioress agrees. He combs through the official library, fingers twitching at the edges of texts. He questions the selection. "Too many commentaries," he says. "Not enough focus on the fathers." You want to ask which fathers? The ones who denied women's souls? The ones who claimed female education was a devil's trick? But you keep quiet. He pulls out a volume of sermons, one that Beatrice once annotated harmlessly, subtly, with a star in the margin beside a particularly tiresome passage about obedience. He stares at the mark for a long time, doesn't say anything, but the next morning, that book is gone from the shelves. You don't panic. You act. That evening, you hand Beatrice a bundle her essays, her poems, her parallels all freshly recopied in your hand. "Take them to the West Woods," you whisper. "Bury them at the 3rd stone past the brook. I'll mark the place." She hesitates. "You'll remember?" She nods, and she goes. Johanna handles the next task. She's quieter than you and smaller. She tucks a scroll into a sack of dried beans bound for the next monastery. You write the label yourself for exchange, cinnamon and advice. You chuckle. It's stupid, but it makes you feel less powerless. The next few days pass like walking on ice. Every conversation feels like a test. Every knock on the dormitory door feels like doom. Then, one afternoon, Brother Sylvan calls for you. You find him in the chapel, alone, hands clasped behind his back. "You've been here a long time," he says without turning. You nod. "Yes, brother. You study? Only what is permitted, and what is not permitted." He turns then, finally meeting your eyes. "What does that include?" You shrug. "I wouldn't know. I've never crossed the line." A lie, but told with such gentleness, it barely sounds like one. He walks closer. You don't move. "You know," he says, "a woman once asked too many questions. They say that's what let the serpent in." You smile. Then it must have been a very good question. For a moment he looks like he might strike you, but he doesn't. He leaves. And you know then that your time is running short. That night, the prioress visits your cell. She doesn't knock. She simply enters, closes the door, and stands beside your bed. "I can't protect you much longer," she says. "He's not here for bookkeeping." You nod. "I know. What do you need?" It's the first time anyone's asked. So you tell her. And together, before dawn, you and Mother Elfrida carry 2 crates of hidden page assessors, treatises, drawings, questions into the old crypt beneath the chapel. The air smells of dust and slow decay. You place them behind a rusted iron grate and seal it with bricks and wax. "I'll say it was mold," she murmurs. You believe her, then you go back to your bed and sleep, at last. You wake to silence and know the heavy, ominous kind that follows bad news, but a thinner, quiet, stretched like thread over a drum, tense, waiting to break. You've felt this before. It's the hush before accusation, before someone says your name with the wrong kind of certainty. The first thing you notice is that Father Berengar is back in the chapel, pale but standing. The second is that Brother Sylvan is gone. No farewell, no explanation, just vanished. The prioress says only, "He's been reassigned," her face unreadable. You say nothing. But later, in the hallway, Johanna catches your eye and mouths a single word. "Burned?" You shake your head. "Not this time," you whisper. Still, you don't relax. You can't, because a vanishing doesn't mean an ending, it means a delay, a postponement, a new storm on a slower wind. So you begin your final work. You take the remaining writings, your newest pages, the ones you hadn't dared to hide yet, and you shape them into something larger. Not just scattered thoughts, but a structure, a curriculum, a guidebook. You call it the mirror of unspoken things. It begins as a reflection on the nature of silence, obedience, doubt, but quickly unfolds into a collection of methods. How to encode questions inside, devotional songs, how to hide essays in needlework patterns, how to use botanical language as code for philosophical inquiry, how to teach a girl without ever once saying, "I'm teaching you." The mirror becomes your masterpiece, a handbook for every clever girl trapped in walls of stone. It's not just survival, it's strategy. It's a blueprint for keeping the mind alive, even when everything else is expected to kneel. Historians still debate whether such texts ever existed, guides passed between women, never acknowledged in public, kept alive through oral tradition or subtle replication. Most agree there's little direct evidence. But as you ink the final page, you understand why. Evidence, after all, gets punished. You bind it by hand. 3 copies. One for the crypt beneath the chapel, one hidden in the seat of the confessional wrapped in a false cover of psalms. The third you place inside a reliquary, behind the glass, replacing the bone fragment of a long-forgotten saint with something holier, the truth. Beatrice weeps when she sees it, not out of fear or sadness, but relief. "I never thought," she whispers, "I'd see someone do it." You smile. "You'll do more." She nods. Johanna's gift is different. She writes music now strange, soft hymns with layered meanings. One melody is titled Cantus Spiralis, a winding line that spirals upward and then vanishes into silence. She never explains what it means. You know. The days settle again into rhythm, but you're changed, all of you, and so is the convent. Not loudly, not visibly, but subtly. A few more sisters stay longer at evening readings. More eyes flicker toward the older books on the shelves. A novice hums one of Johanna's tunes beneath her breath as she scrubs the floors. Someone has scratched a spiral into the corner of the garden wall. Another has drawn one in chalk on the dormitory steps. You didn't write your name. You didn't sign your work. But they know it's you. And then, as all things do in this world, your body begins to slow. Your hands tremble when you write. Your back aches after hours bent over the desk. Your hair, once thick, falls in strands into your lap as you compose your final notes. Beatrice notices. She brings you tea made from violet and mint. Johanna massages your fingers each night. "You've written enough," she says. You laugh. There's no such thing. And yet, you begin to realize this life you carved from stone and silence is ready to outlive you. You start writing shorter pieces, thoughts, sayings, questions without answers. Why does God remain silent to those who think? Is doubt a kind of prayer? What do we owe the women who came before? You tuck them inside prayer books, between recipe pages, inside the wall beside the apothecary jars. You hide them like seeds. Then one morning, as winter thickens outside the chapel and the sun fails to rise on time, a courier arrives. A letter, sealed with the same wax as the one from Paris. You gather with Beatrice and Johanna in the cellar, candlelight flickering against your cheeks. You open the letter. It reads, "We've received your mirror. It is extraordinary. We ask permission to share it anonymous, across our network of scholars. You will not be named, but you will be heard. The ideas will live." And then below it, in different handwriting, to the writer of the spiral, Thank you. You are not alone. That night, you don't sleep. You walk instead through the garden, snow clinging to the edges of your cloak. You look up. The stars are dim. The moon is thin. But they're still there. And so are you. Not in body forever. No, you know that. But your words. They've escaped the walls. They've crossed borders. They've found readers. They live. And because of that, so will every other smart girl who refuses to kneel. The candlelight is softer these days. Or perhaps your eyes have simply adjusted to living in shadows, those delicate corners of silence where truth survives, when spoken words would die. You no longer rush. Your fingers move slowly, deliberately, tracing the contours of each letter, as if committing it not just to parchment, but to memory. Not yours, theirs, the ones yet to come. You feel it now, the way trees must feel their own roots deepening, the slow, certain weight of legacy. You didn't choose this path. You were pushed toward it by a world that feared what your mind could do. But you walked it anyway, quietly, barefoot, bleeding, and now you've reached the edge of something new. Not an ending, not yet, but a handoff. You spend your mornings now teaching the youngest novices not openly, not with fanfare, but when they ask questions during their mending, or when they linger too long over the lines of a psalm, you lean in. You show them where the gaps are. You teach them how to fill those gaps with questions, with wonder, with defiance dressed in devotion. One of them, Emilinius, barely 12, all elbows and suspicion, but she copies your handwriting better than anyone you've ever seen. Why do the stars move if they don't have feet? She asks one day, scowling. You smile. That's the right kind of question. She draws spirals on her scrap cloth now. Another, Alais, hides poems inside her recipe book. She names one, Ode to the Silence Between Bell Chimes. You pretend not to notice, but you leave her a note in return. The silence is where the truth begins. She never speaks of it aloud, but the next day, she adds a second poem titled Echoes from a Crypt. The network is growing. You don't call it that. You don't call it anything. But you know. You feel it. The way a forest begins with unseen shoots, all threading underground, reaching for each other before they ever reach the sky. Historians may never find your name. They'll debate whether this convent ever housed thinkers, or if it was just another quiet prison for inconvenient women. They'll argue over the authenticity of the mirror of unspoken things. They'll puzzle over the spiral, call it an apocryphal symbol, a myth, a mistake. They'll be wrong, and someone may be one of Emmeline's students, or a merchant's daughter who found a loose parchment in the lining of a traded garment will read your words and know, this was real. Your body is beginning to tire. The long nights at the desk, the years of hunched shoulders and careful inkwork have worn you down. You feel it in your spine, in your hands, in your lungs when you climb the chapel steps. But your mind is still alive, still burning. You spend your final weeks writing less, but meaning more. Your last essay is only a single page, no title, just a string of statements, written in the same calm hand as always. A woman who thinks is not a sin. Questions are holy. What we preserve in silence still speaks. If you found this, keep going. You tuck it in the oldest psalter in the convent, the one everyone thinks is too cracked to read. You press it into the binding so deep it won't fall out unless the book is torn apart. You know someone will find it. One day. You've already begun to fade into the rhythm of the convent. The others carry on, singing, cooking, tending the garden. You sit now by the window more often, watching the snow settle on stone. You feel no fear, not anymore, because you've already won. The mirror was sent. The words were heard. The spiral is spreading. A girl in Paris draws it into the corner of her journal. A woman in Rome scratches it into the wood of her writing desk. A nun in York uses it to mark her herbal notes. None of them know your name, but all of them know what it means. There is someone else like you. And now, as the bells toll for evening prayer, and the sky grows dark again, you close your eyes. The silence returns, but it's not empty. It's full of voices your own, and those who came before, and those still to come. All of them whispering not just survival, but something even braver. Understanding. So now, as your breath slows, and your body sinks deeper beneath the covers, picture that final parchment resting in its hiding place. Imagine the ink, still holding steady after all these years, curling in its spiral. Let your mind drift to the stone walls of a convent long buried in time, where clever girls once whispered questions into candlelight and pressed meaning into the margins of books no one else thought to read. You can still hear their footsteps in the dust, still feel the hush of their defiance. Not loud, not angry, just steady, unmoving, like a root that splits stone not with force, but with patience. Let your thoughts soften now. Let the parchment fade into the shadows, safe in its crypt, waiting for discovery. Let the spiral turn once more, gently, until it becomes nothing more than a curl of sleep in your mind. You're safe here. No inquisitors, no threats. Just the quiet hum of legacy and the knowledge that the work of brave, bright, uncelebrated women still echoes, even in silence. And if, as you drift off, you find yourself asking a question no one's ever answered, smile. That's how it all begins. Now close your eyes, breathe deep, and listen to the quiet. Good night.